Thank you very much, Susan, for that kind introduction. And thank you, too, for the many, many years that you have put into work to advance the interests and well-being of migrants and refugees. I'm very honored to have the opportunity to be here at Georgetown at this event, hosted by the president of the university, the Institute for the Study of International Migration, and the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And it's especially appropriate, obviously, to be speaking to you on this 93rd World Day of Migrants and Refugees. I share the hope, as I'm sure everyone in this room would, that the expression in Pope Benedict's statement that this is an occasion to build awareness and recognition of the importance of improving the lives and the opportunities for migrants and refugees, and especially their families, and to recognize the great potential that these people have, that they're not just a problem, that they offer tremendous potential that we cannot allow to just go unmet. It was interesting when I heard that World Migrant and Refugee Day was established as an official Vatican observance by Pope Benedict the 15th, rather than the current Pope Benedict, and that the reason that this is the 93rd day of migrants and refugees is because it was initially proclaimed as a response to the massive displacements and suffering that resulted at the end of the First World War. I'm going to speak today about the U.S. response to the needs of refugees and migrants, and I'm going to focus on the role of the federal government, and in particularly the role of the State Department bureau that I'm honored to head, Population, Refugees, and Migration, which in the future I'm going to call PRM because that's how we refer to ourselves. We're going to talk about both the needs of refugees for assistance and protection, and also the extensive work that we're doing in assisting refugees to be resettled in our own country. Our response to refugees is a moral imperative to alleviate the suffering of other human beings. It's also, however, a very important and positive reflection of American traditions and values, and has a strategic role in our foreign policy priorities. Clearly, people who are in a refugee situation who lose hope are a breeding ground for the problems of terrorism. So I think it's important to recognize that it's not only something that we do because it's the right thing to do, but we also do it because it's in our interests as a country to do it. The theme for this year's commemoration, as Susan said, is the migrant family. The welfare of families and reunification of families is a priority throughout our assistance programs, and bringing refugees into the United States for family reunification is a large piece of our resettlement. The United States is proud, I think justifiably, because of our tradition as an immigrant nation. We are the nation that we are today because of the important contributions of immigrants. Between 2000 and 2005, 3.7 million immigrants chose to become citizens of the United States. During that same period, our nation has also granted legal permanent residence to 5.8 million people. And it is estimated that about 20% of the world's 190 million migrants reside in the United States. I think it's important to recognize that this immigration is occurring even after terrorist attacks on our soil, and at the same time that there's a very spirited debate about immigration policy in the United States. There are people that are saying that we should close the doors, and others contend that we already have shut the doors. But if you look, I think you will see that the Statue of Liberty still faces out, and we remain a welcoming country. Our nation has had many social challenges associated with immigration throughout our history and continues to face these challenges today. But as a society, we are not daunted by them. American society and U.S. government work hard to ensure that immigrants integrate into their communities while retaining their cultural heritage. And I think this is key to our success, that we are able to integrate immigrants into the community. As President Bush has said, immigration is not a problem to be solved. It is the sign of a successful nation. New Americans are to be welcomed as neighbors and not to be feared as strangers. This certainly applies to our response to a special category of immigrants, and that is the refugees and the refugee families who have escaped persecution and conflict, that have no prospect of returning to their home countries in safety and dignity, that need to be permanently resettled and have found a new home and a new life in our country. The United States is the world's largest refugee resettlement country. More than 2.6 million refugees have found a home in the United States since 1975. Last year alone, we admitted 41,000 refugees from 60 different countries. And I have to tell you with pride that we admit more refugees than all of the rest of the world combined. Many of you probably know that we have faced challenges in keeping the door open for our refugee resettlement program. And I know, Susan, you have done a great service in highlighting that fact. A consequence of post-9/11 security changes in our immigration law, justifiably aimed at protecting the American people from terrorists coming into our country, has been much broader than expected and has blocked deserving refugees from our program. I can say that we are on the way to resolving that problem, and just within the last 2 days, we've made a lot of progress. I'm going to return to that, but before I do, I want to talk about some of the other successes of our program. I think that there are two key factors in the success of the U.S. refugee resettlement program, and they are that it is a private-public partnership, and it represents a very strong emphasis on enabling people to become quickly self-reliant. That is not the case with the refugee settlement in many other countries that bring refugees in and keep them on social support structures rather than urging them to become self-reliant, to learn skills, get an education, and find a job. I was recently in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I had the opportunity, and this is one of the really exciting things that I have an opportunity to do, is go out and actually visit with some of our refugees and see our resettlement programs in action, and the people, the American citizens who are helping them to come into our country and build new lives. Services for arriving refugees in Charlottesville are provided by the local office of the International Rescue Committee. This committee is responsible for greeting refugees when they arrive, providing them, ensuring that they have shelter, food, clothing, access to medical care, getting the children enrolled in school, and the other tools that are necessary to become self-reliant, whether it is language training, skills development, but to transition them as quickly as possible to becoming able to stand on their own 2 feet. In addition to the professional staff that I met with in Charlottesville, and I see this at every resettlement program, many of the professional staff were themselves refugees that came here and are now established. But the Charlottesville IRC, like some 360 resettlement agencies similar to that in Charlottesville that we have throughout the United States, depends on volunteers. And the volunteers come from all walks of life. They are high school students, they are law school students, they are women who are staying at home, they are professionals, they are retirees who dedicate themselves to helping the refugees. And these volunteers act as family mentors. They help the new volunteers to acclimate themselves by visiting them in their homes, taking them out in the community, helping them to get used to shopping in a supermarket, which they may never have seen before, helping them with their bill paying and other daily activities. Some of the volunteers tutor in English language. Law school students assist the refugees with immigration paperwork and applications. And I think the results that you see demonstrate America at its very best. On this visit in Charlottesville, I had a very memorable opportunity to visit with a refugee woman from Afghanistan. She had a very tragic past. She had spent years in a refugee camp in Pakistan, living in a tent. She was a widow, as many of the refugees are. Their husbands have been killed in conflict. She was caring without assistance, any assistance, for 2 severely disabled children. She's now the proud owner of a home that was built through Habitat for Humanity, but she had to put 360 hours of sweat labor into the program herself in order to qualify. Her children have wheelchairs for mobility and are getting an education in physical therapy. She works as a healthcare worker, and it's a difficult life. But you know what? It's a life with dignity. She is so grateful to be an American now. In another Habitat for Humanity home that I visited, I met with an Iraqi family. It was a mother and a father. They worked to put each other through school. Multiple jobs. They have a teenage daughter. I think she was about a 12-year-old, but she's already an American teenager with great aspirations for going to college. At a local hotel, I met refugees that are employed there from Darfur, from Russia, from Burma, and the employer, excuse me, just raved about the work ethic, that these refugees are so dedicated. They come to work on time. They're really anxious to improve their status. And I think one of the most exciting things that I see at every refugee resettlement program are the number of refugee entrepreneurs. In Charlottesville, we went to a very successful downtown noodle shop, and the proprietors, the owners of the business, were a Bosnian woman who had come as a refugee, married to a Chinese man who had come as a refugee, and now they own their own business. We also visited a beauty shop that was operated by 2 Bosnian sisters, and a small grocery store owned by 2 Croatian sisters. Now, if this is not the American dream personified, I don't know what is. The mayor spoke to me about the very positive experiences of the city with refugees. And what I have found in most places that I have visited is that refugees are respected and they're appreciated in their communities because they make great contributions to the community. One of the cities that you often hear talked about is Utica, which has been called the city that loves refugees. And refugees actually get credit for turning around a local economy, a city that had gone into decline, had lost a military base, a lot of employers had moved out. The refugees who came from all over, can you imagine being a Somali and landing in Utica, New York? What a shock to your system to discover the weather. But Bosnians, Somalis, Sudanese, people from all over, from many different parts of the world, provided a new workforce for new businesses. They started businesses of their own, and they have been very successful in revitalizing the housing stock and getting Utica back on an upward trend. The work that my bureau does in processing refugees from overseas and overseeing their placement in the United States has had a great and positive impact on the community as well as on the refugees, and it's very gratifying. America provides that opportunity to unlock the positive potentialities that the Pope asks us to remember. Refugee resettlement has had broad support across the political spectrum. I mentioned earlier the difficulties relating to security measures in immigration legislation. I don't know if you've heard this term, but it's been in a lot of newspaper articles, called the material support problem. And that is legislation that was meant to protect America from terrorists. But it casts such a broad net in the definitions that it was barring victims of persecution, victims of conflict, that would otherwise be admissible to our refugee program. And I can tell you that it has had a very broad impact on our numbers of people being able to come into the United States over the last few years. The legislation provided some opportunity for flexibility, and we have worked very hard over the last 2 years trying to reach an agreement whereby the Secretary of State could exercise an authority in the legislation to use a provision that would allow her to declare that the bar is inapplicable for refugee populations that she finds pose no threat to the United States. Secretary Rice initially used that authority on behalf of some of the Burmese refugees that are in Thailand. It's an ethnic group called Karen, and there are 100 and some thousand Karen refugees that have been living in many cases in camps for more than 15 years along the border between Burma and Thailand. Last summer, I was able to visit Thailand, and I was really, really moved to be there when some of the first buses were leaving with some of these ethnic Karen families that were coming to the United States. And I remember getting on one of the buses and talking to these families and saying, where are you going? Well, some were going to Arizona, and some were going to California, and some were going to New Jersey. And you can imagine being a refugee family that has lived in a camp, perhaps have children that have never seen, might be 15 or 16 years old and have never been outside of a refugee camp, and suddenly seeing this opportunity presented to them. It is extremely exciting. We are working on more waivers now for populations in other areas of the world that have also been caught up in this material support bar. And yesterday, I went along with colleagues from the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security to give briefings to both the Senate and House Judiciary Committee and some NGOs on the fact that we are finally, after a lot of work, making a lot of progress that is going to open our program again to a lot of very deserving people that have been excluded or have been on hold. And one of the things that I saw when I was in Thailand, I have to mention because we're talking about families here, is that we had families where the mother and 5 children had been given resettlement, were accepted for resettlement in the United States. The father was barred because the father was a member of a group that fell under this ban in our law. And so the family is presented with the Hobson's choice of, do we split the family and some come to the United States and the father stays behind, or do we all stay living in a crowded refugee camp? That's not a choice we want to present to anyone. So we are going to continue seeking a change in the law that only Congress can do, that will allow families that fall into this situation because one member of the family has been a member of one of these groups that is being barred from the U.S. And that is something that we hope this coming session of the Congress will take care of. DHS, Department of Homeland Security, is also going to be issuing some instructions that will be addressing some of the more difficult cases that you may have read about in the paper, where someone has provided assistance, what is called material support, maybe giving a bowl of rice to a militia that has come through their village. And in some of the cases have been just absolutely unbelievable, where a woman saw her husband killed in front of her. She was dragged off and raped, but she provided material support in the form of having been forced to wash uniforms for the militia. And these are cases called duress, assistance provided under duress, that we are working very hard to find a solution for. As a result of the changes that I think are finally coming in our laws, we expect to see a much more robust program next year. But what about the 12 million refugees around the world who are still waiting for some kind of a durable solution? Resettlement is only at best going to be available to a small number. Probably less than 100,000 people worldwide will be resettled in the coming year, or that's pretty typical. The vast majority of people who are refugees want to go home. And one day, we hope to be able to help them go home in safety and dignity. And we support the United Nations High Commission for Refugees that does a lot of work on repatriation. But the plight of refugees who are awaiting some kind of a solution, either to be able to go home or to come and be resettled in another country, deserves a lot more attention. The United States, you, the taxpayer, spend about $600 million a year working with the UN and other international organizations to provide assistance to refugees in the camps in the host countries. We fund life-saving nutrition, clean water, sanitation, and health care. We also promote programs such as education and skills training that will give refugees an opportunity, when they have an opportunity to go either home or to another country, to have some livelihood experience so they can be self-reliant. We pay a lot of attention to what is going on and the changing needs around the world. And that means today we are concentrating on the situation of Iraqis who have fled in large numbers, sectarian violence within Iraq, and in huge numbers today are in Jordan, in Syria, some in Egypt. We're focused on the situation in Somalia. We support refugees from Darfur who are in camps in Chad, the displaced in the Sudan. Child refugees and internally displaced persons are especially, we are particularly focused on, because so many of them are unaccompanied minors, and they are among the most vulnerable populations in the world. Imagine losing your home, your sense of security. Imagine losing your parents. Imagine being separated from anything that has ever been familiar to you, from your families. These children, these unaccompanied children, are more in danger of malnutrition. They are extremely susceptible to diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS. And older children are vulnerable to being recruited as child soldiers, and they are very vulnerable to sexual exploitation, including trafficking. So protection and assistance to child refugees is a major part of all of our programs. We fund the bulk of what we do through, again, the United Nations Commission on Refugees and the International Committee of the Red Cross. The United States is the largest single donor to UNHCR. We support their work to address 5 priority issues for refugee children: separation from families and caregivers, sexual exploitation, abuse and violence, military recruitment, as I said, as child soldiers, education, and other special concerns of adolescents. In Africa earlier this year, I visited several of the programs that we fund through NGOs to assist refugee children. In Kenya, I visited a therapeutic feeding program in Kakuma Camp. I visited a preschool and some absolutely terrific vocational education programs. As a former teacher, I have to tell you that many teachers in the United States would just love to have the eagerness for education that you see in these refugee children who have very little opportunity to get it. In addition to education, we have also made gender-based violence a priority for the Bureau. We're working, and I want to talk a little bit about both of these areas. We're working very hard to get the resources that President Bush made available through the Africa Education Initiative, some of these available to refugee children in camps. We're looking at innovative ways to get more education to the children through things like distance learning. We cannot, as a society, allow adults to despair of an opportunity to rebuild their lives. We cannot allow children to be recruited as child soldiers or women to be exploited and trafficked. Access to education for boys and girls and keeping girls in school longer provides a way out of despair, and it provides for many of these children the only normalcy that they can see in their lives. The Pope's message makes special mention of the added scourge of sexual exploitation of women and girls in refugee camps, and this is indeed, within our programming, one of our great concerns. Sexual violence and exploitation that is associated with psychological trauma, the risk of sexually transmitted diseases are terrible dangers confronting refugees today. My Bureau has been adamant in insisting on improved protection for refugee women and girls and have provided significant funding to help this. But since 2002, we have required that all of our overseas assistance partners that implement programs on the ground adopt a code of conduct that protects refugees from sexual exploitation and abuse. We work with our partners as they implement these standards, and we work on programs that increase awareness, that provide skills, and focus on investigating and addressing abuse and exploitation. When I was in Kenya last year, it was very exciting to see that all of the NGOs that provide assistance in Kenya to refugees had come together and had adopted a protocol on sexual exploitation and abuse. The project there is building the prevention and response capacity of agencies that work with refugees in the camps, as well as among urban refugees. It has strong support from implementing partners and the refugee community. It's a protocol that we think could serve as a model in many other countries in Africa and other areas. You've probably seen articles about the abuse of women by not only peacekeepers, but sometimes by the NGOs and other groups that are there to help them, and this is just not acceptable. We sponsor a legal advocacy program in West Africa, for example, that enables women to prosecute their abusers. This is critical if we're going to break the culture of impunity that allows the abuse. So consideration goes into all of our standards for safety of women and children. Although most of our program relates to refugees, I do want to mention work on behalf of migrants. A lot of this is diplomatic activity. We advocate on behalf of migration policies that are humane and that stress orderly and authorized movements of individuals with an emphasis on their safety and protection. And one major issue in this category is trafficking in persons. As Pope John Paul II stated, and I quote, "The trade in human persons constitutes a shocking offense against human dignity and a grave violation of fundamental human rights. I call it modern-day slavery." Combating trafficking in persons is a major foreign policy priority for this administration. In FY05, our government spent approximately $95 million to fund programs in 101 countries to support efforts to combat human trafficking. Our total over the last 5 years has been a significant $375 million that we have spent around the world working with other countries to help them develop their laws and their systems to protect people, prevent trafficking, and assist the victims. My Bureau concentrates our funding on information campaigns to prevent trafficking in persons. We provide medical and psychosocial support to assist the victims, and we help victims to return home and to integrate into society. An example, in the Dominican Republic, we support an anti-trafficking program that is doing marvelous work in helping victims to reclaim their lives. Women and girls that had been from the Dominican Republic, promised jobs as housekeepers, arrived in Colombia and Argentina and found themselves not housekeepers, but captured as sex slaves. Our program, which is carried out by the International Organization for Migration and other non-government organizations, assists victims when they are fortunate enough to escape and or perhaps we hope be rescued, but we help them to get back to their home country and to rebuild their lives. Destitute, vulnerable, many of these young women are now under the protection of the Sisters of the Congregation of, and I'm not sure I know how to pronounce this, Adoratrices? Well, I guess I'm not the only one. But at any rate, it's a Catholic order that provides support and training for them to get a new start in life. My staff visited there recently and interviewed victims that had heartbreaking stories of suffering, but also inspiring stories of recovery. One young woman who had been a trafficking victim is now on her way to becoming a lawyer. Another enterprising young woman, 22 years old, single, with a child to support, was given vocational training and has set up her own business. She's in a country with great poverty and little opportunity, but she found a wholesale source of baby clothing, and she set up a market stall right in front of the maternity hospital. Business is very good, and she's now supporting herself and her children, and is very proud that she has been able, for the first time in her life, to open a bank account. It's no coincidence that a religious order is carrying out this work. The Catholic Church and other religious organizations have historically taken strong action to assist trafficking victims. Beginning with a program that we funded in Rome 3 years ago, we have worked to build the capacity of religious organizations to work with this special population. We have developed specialized training programs that we have been implementing in a number of countries. And our goal and our interest in supporting the work of this project is to help to develop a transnational network of women religious that are active in the field of social prevention of trafficking and assistance to victims. Now let me just end with a call to action. I know that many of you are interested and involved in refugee and migrant rights and issues. Somebody shared with me a prayer card that was distributed by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops last Sunday, a prayer for migrants and refugees. And in part it reads, "Grant us the grace to welcome them with Christian hospitality, so that these brothers and sisters of ours may find acceptance and understanding on their journey." In that spirit, I would call on all of you to get involved, if you're not already. Join one of the many initiatives that are sponsored by your colleagues, your friends that are here in this room. I understand the Institute's humanitarian network is a very good place to start. But volunteer with a refugee program. Get to know some of these really wonderful and courageous people. You will be inspired by the opportunity. Show them hospitality. Remember them in your thoughts and prayers. There are many, many ways that you can be of help. Get on the computer. Many people say, where do I start? Get on the computer, go to our website. We'll give you lots of ideas, but we need help. These people need your support. So thank you very much, Susan, for the opportunity to talk about the work that we do, work that I have an opportunity to tell people when they ask me, do you like your job? I say, how many jobs can you go to every day where you know you're saving lives? And we do that. We're keeping hope alive in millions of people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Sauerbrey is agreed to answer questions. There is a microphone in the middle, and we are taping this, so please do use the microphone so that we have the record of the question. Yes.
Just to get the ball rolling.
Please also introduce yourselves and your organization, or if you're at Georgetown, what your school is.
I'm Jack Martin with the Federation for American Immigration Reform. I congratulate you for the efforts of your Bureau, of the State Department. It is an effort in which I participated when I was working for the Department of State as well. I just wonder if you mentioned a $600 million amount of contributions to the overseas settlement effort, or the overseas refugee effort. I wondered if you can identify a similar amount of money that is dedicated to the refugee resettlement efforts in the United States. I know that it doesn't all fall under your jurisdiction. And also, I'm wondering whether or not any progress has been made in the effort to try to encourage other countries to undertake more refugees for permanent resettlement in order to reduce the statistic that you referred to, in which the United States is taking more than half of all of the refugees for permanent resettlement every year.
Yes, both of these being near to my heart, because we're struggling right now to ensure that we have adequate funding for a robust refugee program. And I'm sorry, I don't have that on the tip of my tongue, but my best recollection, and please don't quote me, is that the resettlement program is funded at around $250 million. I think that's fairly close. In terms of, are we trying to get other countries? Absolutely. There are many other countries that have the capacity to join the United States in this effort. And we have actually funded capacity building programs in 3 Latin American countries, Costa Rica, Argentina, and Brazil, to help them to build a resettlement program. I just had a visitor from another country a country that is being flooded right now with African refugees into Europe. The country was Malta. And Malta is looking for training help from the United States to help them to understand how to build their program. They're very willing to have a resettlement program, but they are looking for, how do we do this successfully? How do we manage to integrate without without seeing the kinds of problems that France and some other of the European countries have had? So we are not only training, but every time that I go to an international meeting of any sort, I'm constantly making the same argument to other countries, that the United States is doing its share, but a lot of countries need to step up to the plate and join us, because we can never meet all the needs that are out there unless it's a worldwide, global effort.
Hi, my name is Dan Swanwick, and I'm a third-year law student, and I'm also a certificate student with the Institute for the Study of International Migration. I had a question. You talked about the real ID bars to material support, and you mentioned duress as one of the things that you wanted, that the State Department wants to introduce as an exception. Are there other avenues, such as, say, a de minimis exception for the bowl of rice given, or a lack of knowledge exception if you don't know you're giving material support at the time? Are those also priorities of the State Department, or are you focusing more on the duress exception?
Well, first of all, this determination is really one that Department of Homeland Security has been addressing, and it will be done through the Department of Homeland Security. My understanding is that a de minimis exception is not going to be considered because of the great potential of impacting on litigation cases. But the biggest, really, the biggest areas of concern have been the duress cases. And they're going to start with a process that will allow them to consider, and of course each individual, let me make this point, each individual has to be adjudicated on an individual basis by a circuit rider from the Department of Homeland Security who is out in the region, and who makes the determination that this person would be otherwise eligible to be resettled in the United States were it not for the fact that they provided duress to an organization that falls in, I don't want to complicate this, a Tier 3 group. I think if we can get that piece resolved so that they feel comfortable that their adjudicators are able to make these decisions well and without endangering the U.S., they will then look at other kinds of circumstances. But that's the starting point. And most of these cases that you have seen that have been the horrible stories that just defy any common sense are duress cases that I think, and a lot of the de minimis also, fall under duress. So hopefully we'll take care of much of this problem.
Thank you.
Alana Sheikh from International Medical Corps. IMC is active in Iraq, and we have seen increasing numbers of refugees coming out of Iraq, and surveys we've done have seen an increase in intent to leave the country. Can you talk a little bit about PRM and your goals for Iraqi refugees?
Yes, thank you. That is a very, very current issue that is, I would say, the number one thing that we are focusing on right now, as you can well imagine. There are indeed, estimates are not verifiable, but there are indeed something on the order of magnitude of 500,000 to 700,000 people that are in Syria, and another 500,000 to 700,000 that are in Jordan. Now, I want to make the point that about half of those probably are people who had fled during the Saddam Hussein regime prior to 2003. So what we're looking at today is an increasing outflow of people that are fleeing from general sectarian violence. I would put our efforts into 3 points. First and foremost is trying to create the conditions in Iraq that will allow people to go home safely and in dignity. Because most of the refugees, or most of the people who have fled, want just to be able to live at home again in peace. There are, however, a lot of people who have been out of the country. They may have left as middle-class people with resources, but because they can't work in Jordan and Syria, which does not recognize them as refugees, they are becoming more and more destitute in many cases and vulnerable. So we are looking at how can we increase our assistance level through significantly increasing our funding to UNHCR, which is the organization that is providing assistance, and through NGOs, and through bilateral assistance directly to Jordan. These countries, these surrounding countries, have been very generous. I mean, Jordan has been hosting a huge population of Palestinians for, 40 years. How many? 60 years. Long time. And we don't want to see the social services safety net being so overloaded that it creates havoc in the surrounding countries. So number 2 is provide more assistance to the vulnerable refugees. We are funding now UNHCR to do a registration of refugees so that we can identify who they are, when they came, and also we're looking at trying to fund another organization to do a survey so that we have a better understanding of the humanitarian needs. Number 3 is there are going to be some who will never be able to return home, and we understand that. Some are people who have been translators, done other kinds of work for the U.S. government, whose lives are threatened. Some are Christian groups who do not believe that they will ever be able to find a home even after Iraq is pacified. So the third element is to identify the vulnerable, whoever they may be, and beef up our resettlement program. That means we're going to have to go through the same kinds of issues that we go through with any resettlement program. It does not happen very, very rapidly. And particularly in this post-9/11 era, because of the security issues, actually getting people screened and ready for processing into the United States is going to take a while, but we're very much in the process of trying to look at how quickly we can do this, but first and foremost, identifying the most vulnerable, because with the large number, 1.5 million or whatever that number happens to be that are outside of Iraq, it will only be a small number that we are able to actually resettle in the U.S. But these are the 3 parts of our strategy.
Hi, my name is Saul Lakin. I'm here visiting with one of my high school international relations class. So first off, I'd like to thank Professor Martin for inviting us, and I'd like to thank my teacher, Mr. Perlman, for taking us here. And so basically, I heard you mention in the beginning of your talk that how great it was to see these refugees that you helped become a true part of our society, and really help our economy and get their own jobs and their own houses. And then later on, you mentioned that it was also your goal to get them back to their home country eventually. And so I guess I was just sort of wondering how exactly that worked. If you did all this work to almost make them Americans, like you mentioned the 12-year-old girl who was becoming a real American teenager. I was just wondering, how you work to get them back to their own country.
Thank you. It sounds like I created a little confusion, which I apologize. They're two separate issues. As we address the refugee issues, we're looking for what are called durable solutions. There are three durable solutions. One is to be able to have people go home. That's the first and foremost goal for most refugees. They're in a host country that is usually a troubled country that lacks resources itself. So the host country is not a place that many of them can stay. So the first goal is get people able to go home, and we work to create conditions. And there's some great success stories. For example, 3 million Afghans who were in Pakistan have gone home. But we work to create the conditions in Afghanistan programming to ensure that once they go back, they're able to stay there. Large numbers going home to Liberia. Those are two really, I think, good examples. We also work with host countries where it's possible to say, some of these people are never going to be able to go home from Thailand back to Burma. Thailand, can you create a condition where you will accept and create a citizenship opportunity, permanent residency, whatever you want to call it, for some of this refugee population? Third option, smallest option really, is resettlement. When we resettle people in the United States and they become United States citizens, we're not trying to get them to go home again. I mean, that is a permanent, durable solution for the people who come here. Very seldom, but occasionally, there are situations in the world where people come to the United States in our refugee program and conditions at home improve to a degree that they decide they want to go home. And of course, they're free to do that. So it's a small number, but when the refugee arrives here, they may come into that program that I mentioned in Charlottesville. But once they've been settled in the United States, they're just like any other American. They can go wherever they want to go. They can live in California or wherever they want to live, or they can decide at a point in time that they miss their relatives and things are good back home again, and they can go home. And we're very happy when that happens.
Thank you very much.
We'll take the last two questions together and then
Sure.
give you the
Okay.
opportunity. Please, both of you come forward.
Hi, I'm Sue from Emerson Prep High School. I was wondering whether you thought remittances are more effective than us giving financial aid to getting to the people, because you said it represents 10% of GDP for third world countries.
For some countries, yes. Remittances certainly are very valuable because they go directly to the families of the refugee of the migrant, the person who is here. So they are very valuable, and they do, because the family is using that money for their own well-being. It does support the local economy. I am not enough of an expert in that area to have to be able to really give you much of an opinion about whether that is more valuable than our assistance, but I kind of suspect it is, primarily because it's going of individuals.
Yeah, there's no third party.
Right. So probably Dr. Martin would.
Well, thanks. I was just.
Please, the last question.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Murphy, and I work for the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking, and I'm a project manager for our child labor and education projects in Eastern Africa primarily. I used to attend here at Georgetown. I was a certificate student of Dr. Martin's, and incidentally, my parents did support your run for governor of Maryland.
Thank them for me.
Sure will. But my question to you is, I was just visiting recently some IDP camps in northern Uganda, and as far as I know, I think from what I heard from the NGOs working there, the U.S. Department of Labor is one of the only donors that are working there currently, on issues relating to children and providing education. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what PRM was doing to address the situation of IDPs in northern Uganda, and maybe just hear a little bit more about the work that you do to educate children in the refugee camps where you're providing support.
Boy, you've given me a broad subject here. First of all, let me make a differentiation that some in the audience may not understand between what is a refugee and what is an IDP. A refugee and an IDP have very similar characteristics, except that the refugee has crossed an international border. The IDP, internally displaced person, has all the same characteristics of having fled from violence, persecution, Darfur being the perfect example. Within Sudan, within Darfur, many people are internally displaced within their own country. Their villages have been burned down. They're in IDP camps. Others have fled across an international border and are in Chad, and those are refugees. So that's a distinction. PRM, within the structure of the U.S. government, funds the refugee program. We also, because we are the chief funder of UNHCR, which is now taking on more and more of the programming for internally displaced, we are getting more involved in IDPs. However, USAID is the lead agency within our government for funding IDP programming. And I can't really speak to what USAID is doing in Uganda. I would certainly think that they're heavily involved in food and other kinds of work in those deplorable IDP camps in Uganda. You asked about education, and one of the things that has been a real quagmire has been trying to figure out how you can provide education in, whether it's an IDP or a refugee situation, without that being a magnet for bringing more people. Let me give you just a real quick little story. When I was in Kakuma camp in Kenya, the projections had been that approximately 54,000 of the refugees in that camp that were Southern Sudanese, and we've been trying to promote returns to Southern Sudan, were going to go home that year. I was there in March of this past year, and instead of seeing a large number of people going back to Southern Sudan, 18,000 new refugees had arrived in Kakuma camp. And when I was inquiring who were they, why were they coming, because conditions in Southern Sudan were such that we were trying to, the people should have been going in the other direction. I was told that they were primarily young men between the ages of about 18 and 25. And why were they coming? They were coming because there was education available in Kakuma camp that was not available in Southern Sudan. So it demonstrates the importance of being able to, the importance of the education to the population is, I think, the most important message. But then the importance of ensuring that as you are trying to create conditions for people to return to their homes from IDP situations or refugee situations, that the services that they want most, which are education and healthcare, are there. And this is an area where my bureau has to work more closely with USAID, which is the development agency, in ensuring that that happens. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Well, please join me in thanking Mrs. Sauerbrey for very, very thoughtful comments, both through the lecture and her great answers to many of your great questions. So thank you for coming.